In this episode, you learn how to turn the Spring Boot project into a database-backed Spring Boot project. More specifically, this will be done in 2 steps. First, you need to set up the infrastructure, which you'll learn how to do in this episode, and then you can go on to writing SQL queries, etc. So let's get started. As you want to connect to a database, you need some more library dependencies on your project's class path. So open up the pom.xml file, duplicate the Spring Boot starter web dependency, and then rename the web suffix to JDBC. And this will pull in Spring Boot's JDBC support, which means you get all the tools you need to talk to databases. Also, in this episode, I want you to use an embedded Java database called H2. You could also use MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, whatever you want, but the steps needed are pretty much the same for every database, and with an embedded database, you don't have to install anything, so it's easier for you. Open up a browser, go to mavenrepository.com, search for H2, click the latest version, and copy and paste the dependency to your pom.xml file. Good. That's all the libraries we need. And as a matter of fact, Spring Boot could automatically configure embedded databases for you. But I want to go a bit more into detail in this episode, so open up the application.properties file, and then you'll have to add 4 properties. And they all start with spring.datasource. So create 4 lines. And then the first line should have a key that ends with URL, and it's the database URL you want to connect to. And then simply give it a value of JDBC:h2:mem:, which will create an in-memory database once you boot up the application, and the database will get destroyed once you shut down the application again. Exactly what we need in this episode. The next line should have a key username and the value of SA. Don't ask me why, but it's the default H2 username. The third line should have a key password, and it can be empty because by default the H2 user SA has an empty password. And then finally, you need a driver class name, which should have a value of org.h2.driver. And if you don't want to use an H2 database, simply put in the appropriate values for your MySQL database or your Oracle database, etc. It's the same file and the same properties for every database. So a quick recap, you added the libraries, you also configured the Spring application properties file, and the last thing that's missing is to have a database schema, tables. And again, Spring Boot offers you to execute SQL scripts whenever you boot up your application. So simply create a file called schema.sql in source main resources. And in there, you're going to write, in 1 line, by the way, if you put it to multiple lines, it won't work. Create table customer, and then have a quick look at the customer class. And you can see you need an int ID, then strings for the first name, last name, and status properties, and a date column for the birth date. So back to the schema SQL, write ID int primary key, first name varchar 100, last name varchar 100, status varchar 20, and birth date date. That's all you need. Good. So now you probably want to check if all of that worked. So go to the customer service test class, delete the before method where you initialize the customer service to a new and empty customer service every time you run a test method, because as you now need to boot up a Spring container for the class, which configures the data sources and whatnot, you'll have to annotate the class with the run with annotation, put in Spring Runner, then add a Spring Boot test annotation, as well as add an import annotation with a customer service class value. And you'll need these annotations if you want to use Spring Boot test support in your test class like we want to do. Now, you can make the customer service auto-wired. And in addition, if you open up the customer service, add 2 new fields, both auto-wired. The first one is a private data source, and this is the data source which Spring Boot will automatically configure for us whenever it reads the spring.datasource.properties from the application properties file, and then it will simply do its magic. And the second one is a JDBC template. And whenever you add the JDBC dependency that we added in the pom.xml file, Spring will also automatically configure a JDBC template for us, so you can start writing SQL queries right away. So now put in a breakpoint in any method of that class, and then let's debug our test. And the application boots up, and when it boots up, you can see in the console, there's quite a lot of stuff happening because now a whole Spring Boot container boots up. And then finally, when you break at the breakpoint, you can see that in the debugger, that Spring actually created and injected the data source. It also injected the JDBC template. And when you open up that data source, you can even see it has the right value set, like the URL, JDBC, the h2mem URL, and the other ones. Furthermore, when you scan through the log and look for schema.sql, you'll also see that Spring Boot executed our SQL statement, so it created the tables. Great! You just set up all the infrastructure needed for Spring Boot's database support. That means you can now write SQL queries and change the customer service class to use the database, which you'll do in the next episode. So let's get right after it.